The black janitor who took a bullet for a Mafia boss and shattered him. Gunfire rips through the ballroom of the Meridian Hotel on Michigan Avenue. Guests scream and scatter as tables flip and glass explodes across the marble floor. Security shouts are swallowed by the sound of automatic weapons. Diane Foster is supposed to be nowhere near this. She is 42, dressed in a Navy janitor's uniform, braids tucked beneath a bandana, paid to clean up after powerful people, not die for them. Still, she runs toward the noise. Across the room, Lorenzo Castellano is trapped behind an overturned table. Blood runs down his forehead, blurring his vision. He reaches for his gun as a shooter moves into position on his blind side, finger tightening on the trigger. Diane sees it before anyone else does. She moves without hesitation. No warning. No calculation. The bullet meant for Chicago's most feared Mafia underboss slams into her chest. Her body crashes into Lorenzo's arms. Blood spreads across his white shirt as he stares down at the woman who just stepped between him and death. This is a man who has ordered men killed without blinking. Now his hands shake as he presses against her wound, his face stripped of control, power, and certainty. How did a hotel janitor end up taking a bullet for one of the most dangerous men in the Midwest? And why did that single act destroy him? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe now so you don't miss tomorrow's story. A special shout out to all our viewers, both new and returning, from the United States, Canada, Netherlands, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and every corner of the world. Thank you for being here and supporting these stories. You're the reason we keep creating them. Let's begin. Diane Foster learned early that survival was not about strength or luck. It was about staying unnoticed. She grew up in Englewood, on Chicago's South Side, in a narrow brick building that always smelled faintly of bleach and fried food. Sirens were part of the neighborhood's daily rhythm. Some nights they sang until morning. Other nights, the quiet felt worse. Diane understood before she was 10 years old that noise meant trouble, and silence meant something had already gone wrong. Her grandmother, Lillian May Foster, used to tell her stories about Mississippi. About long fields, hard labor, and hands that never healed properly. Lillian had come north as a young woman during the Great Migration, carrying one suitcase and a belief that Chicago would give her children more than the South ever could. What Chicago gave her instead was factory work, cramped apartments, and a lifetime of cleaning jobs that left her bones aching before she turned 50. Diane's mother, Ruth, followed the same path with fewer illusions. She cleaned houses along the North Shore, places with wide lawns, quiet streets, and owners who never bothered to learn her name. She would leave before sunrise and come home after dark, her knees stiff, her fingers cracked from chemicals. Ruth never complained. She believed complaining wasted energy better spent enduring. Diane absorbed those lessons without being taught. Keep your head down. Do your work. Do not draw attention. Attention made people curious, and curiosity led to trouble. School was something she passed through rather than enjoyed. She was a good student when she applied herself, but hunger and exhaustion often won. By the time she graduated high school, college felt like a distant idea meant for other people. She worked instead. First at a grocery store. Then at a nursing home. Then, eventually, at hotels. She met Gerald Foster at 23. He worked the line at a Ford assembly plant in Hegewisch and smelled faintly of oil and metal when he came home. He was steady, quiet, and kind in ways that did not demand recognition. They married at City Hall and moved into a small apartment, filling it with thrift store furniture and the belief that stability counted as happiness. For a while, it did. When Diane became pregnant, Gerald cried in the kitchen, his hands shaking as he held the positive test. They talked about names. They talked about moving somewhere quieter. They talked about futures neither of them had ever allowed themselves to imagine. The pregnancy ended at 5 months. No one ever found a clear reason. Diane left the hospital empty-handed and learned a new form of silence, one that settled deep in her chest and never fully left. Gerald tried to be strong, but grief wore him down slowly, like rust. His heart failed 6 years later while he was at work. One moment he was tightening bolts. The next, he was gone. Diane was 35 and alone again. She took the job at the Meridian Hotel 2 years later. It was supposed to be temporary. Just something stable while she figured out what came next. 7 years passed before she noticed time had moved without asking her permission. The Meridian was a world unto itself. Gold-trimmed walls. Marble floors polished until they reflected the ceiling. Guests who spoke loudly and tipped inconsistently. Staff who learned quickly when to look away and when to move faster. Diane learned those rules faster than most. She worked nights by preference. Fewer guests. Fewer questions. Fewer eyes. She cleaned conference rooms after midnight meetings she was never meant to understand. She emptied trash from suites that smelled of cigars and expensive cologne. She learned which elevators to avoid and which hallways were safer after dark. Everyone knew the Castellano family ran the hotel. No one said it out loud. You did not need to. Their presence was felt in the way management responded instantly to certain requests and ignored others. Diane never saw violence directly, but she felt its shape. She understood when to step back, when to finish faster, when to pretend she had not heard raised voices through closed doors. Invisibility was not weakness. It was armor. She wore her uniform neatly pressed, her hair braided and tucked beneath a bandana. Her shoes made little sound. She kept her face calm and her posture neutral. She did her job well enough to avoid complaints, but never so well that someone might remember her name. At 42, her hands told her story better than her face ever could. Dry skin. Small scars. Nails kept short because anything longer caught on cloth and slowed her down. She moved through the hotel like a fixture, present but rarely acknowledged. Her apartment in Bronzeville suited her. 1 bedroom. Clean lines. No clutter. Photographs of her mother and Gerald on a small shelf. A couch she rarely used. Most nights she ate standing up in the kitchen, listening to the radio, letting voices fill the quiet without demanding anything from her. This was the life she had chosen after everything else was taken. At the Meridian, she spoke politely but briefly. She avoided gossip. She did not linger in break rooms. Other staff liked her well enough, but no one knew her deeply. That was intentional. Deep connections led to questions. Questions led to exposure. Diane believed firmly that the hotel rewarded those who understood their place. She did not challenge management. She did not ask why certain guests were treated differently. She did not react when envelopes exchanged hands in service corridors. She cleaned, she clocked out, she went home. The Castellanos existed at a distance, like weather. Dangerous if you ignored the signs. Manageable if you respected them. She had seen Lorenzo Castellano many times before he ever saw her. She knew his schedule before she knew his name. She knew when his security detail changed and when they did not. She knew he preferred late nights and rarely left before dawn. She knew his penthouse generated more trash than any other floor. But knowing was not the same as being known. For years, she entered his suite when it was empty or when he was elsewhere. When he was present, she kept her eyes low, her movements efficient. Most powerful men liked that. It reassured them. Her survival philosophy had served her well. She had lasted 7 years in a building tied to organized crime without incident. She had never been questioned, threatened, or noticed. She believed that was success. On her days off, she walked the neighborhood. She bought groceries from the same store. She waved to the same neighbors. Her life did not expand, but it held. Diane did not dream of more. Dreams required energy she no longer wanted to spend. She believed invisibility was permanent. A condition you accepted and adapted to, not something you escaped. Until the night it failed her. Until the night someone looked at her and did not look away. Until the night her greatest protection stopped being enough. Lorenzo Castellano was never meant to lead. That role belonged to his older brother Matteo, the firstborn, the favored son, the one trained from childhood to inherit the Castellano empire. Matteo learned the business at their father's knee, absorbing rules and debts and alliances before he was old enough to drive. He knew which families mattered, which grudges never faded, and which favors came with a cost that would be collected years later. Lorenzo grew up adjacent to all of it but never fully inside. Where Matteo embraced expectation, Lorenzo resisted it. He was quieter, more observant. He spent hours sketching buildings in notebooks he hid beneath his bed, fascinated by structure and balance rather than power. Their father tolerated this difference because Matteo existed. One heir was enough. The illusion held until it didn't. Matteo was killed outside a restaurant in Little Italy on a warm spring evening. He had just finished dinner with 2 lieutenants when the shots came. Clean. Fast. Planned. The Petrovs out of Hammond had ordered it, a calculated message delivered in public. By the time Lorenzo arrived at the scene, his brother was already gone, blood dark against the pavement, the life drained out of the man who had always stood between Lorenzo and the family's expectations. After that night, there was no buffer. Lorenzo tried to run before the ground fully settled over Matteo's grave. He enrolled full-time at the University of Illinois Chicago, focusing on architecture with a seriousness that bordered on desperation. He rented a modest apartment in Lincoln Park, far from family territory. He dated women who thought he was distant, intense, occasionally distracted, but never dangerous. None of them knew his last name carried weight that could crush them. For a while, it almost worked. He designed buildings late into the night, losing himself in plans that obeyed rules he could understand. Gravity. Load. Purpose. Buildings did not lie. They either stood or failed. People were less predictable. The call came 3 weeks after Matteo's funeral. Their father, Vincent Castellano, did not shout. He never needed to. His voice carried authority because it was backed by decades of survival. He told Lorenzo to come home. He said the family needed him. He said Matteo was gone. What he did not say was that there was no one else. The burial at Mount Carmel Cemetery marked the end of Lorenzo's resistance. As dirt filled the grave and mourners stepped back, Vincent looked at his remaining son. There was no anger in his expression, only certainty. Blood was blood. Choice was a luxury the Castellanos did not believe in. Within months, Lorenzo was inside the machine he had spent his life avoiding. He learned quickly because he had to. Meetings. Deals. Consequences. He discovered that fear was easier to manage than respect and that hesitation invited challenge. He hardened himself because softness drew blood. By 38, he occupied the penthouse suite at the Meridian Hotel. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced Lake Michigan, offering a view that tourists paid thousands to admire. Lorenzo rarely noticed it. The suite was spacious, quiet, and secure. It was also a cage built of privilege and obligation. Every day brought decisions that carried weight. Some cost money. Some cost loyalty. Some cost lives. Lorenzo did not enjoy any of it, but he did not hesitate. The family survived because he made choices others could not. Those who worked for him feared him. Those who opposed him respected him. Those who tried to understand him usually failed. He slept little. When he did sleep, it was restless. His body carried reminders of past attempts on his life, scars hidden beneath tailored suits. He ate when someone reminded him. He spoke when necessary. He trusted almost no one. Power filled the space where purpose should have been. The staff at the Meridian treated him like a force of nature. They avoided eye contact. They moved faster when he passed. When he entered a room, conversations ended. People disappeared. He expected that. He relied on it. Until one night, someone didn't. It was a Tuesday in October. Rain pressed against the windows, streaking the city lights into blurred lines. Lorenzo stood near the glass, jacket discarded, thoughts drifting toward nothing in particular. He barely registered the door opening behind him. A janitor entered. She moved with calm efficiency, crossing the room without hesitation. She did not freeze. She did not retreat. She simply did her job, emptying trash bins and straightening items out of habit rather than obligation. Lorenzo turned, already prepared to dismiss her with a look. She met his gaze briefly, nodded once, and continued working. That alone was unusual. Most staff rushed through the penthouse as if the walls might close in on them. This woman did not. She worked as if he were furniture. As she reached the door, she paused. "You should eat something," she said. Her voice was steady. Not deferential. Not afraid. "The kitchen closes in an hour." Then she left. No apology. No explanation. No attempt to linger. Lorenzo stood still long after the door closed. The comment was small. Ordinary. It carried no agenda. In his world, concern usually came disguised as strategy. This did not. It landed without force, settling somewhere uncomfortable. He realized he did not know her name. That bothered him. Over the following days, he found himself aware of her presence in ways that surprised him. He noticed her timing, her consistency, the way she never seemed rushed or curious. When she entered rooms where power gathered, she did not change pace or posture. She was not careless. She was deliberate. He requested her for the penthouse under the pretense of routine. Management complied without question. She continued to behave exactly as before. She did not ask for favors. She did not smile excessively. She did not acknowledge his authority beyond basic courtesy. Once, he left money on the nightstand. $100, placed carefully. When he returned, it was still there. Another time, he spoke first. "You've been here a while," he said. "Yes, sir." That was all. Lorenzo had faced men who wanted him dead. He had negotiated with rivals who hid knives behind their smiles. None of that unsettled him the way this woman's indifference did. She did not want anything from him. That made her dangerous in a way he could not explain. He began watching for her without admitting it, timing his movements through service corridors, lingering longer than necessary, listening for her footsteps. She continued not to notice him. The woman who cleaned his floors refused to acknowledge the man everyone else feared. And for the first time since Matteo died, Lorenzo Castellano felt something shift. Diane noticed the change before Lorenzo said a single word to her. It began with timing. He appeared more often when she worked the upper floors. Not close enough to justify suspicion, but close enough to feel intentional. A pause near an elevator. A glance held a fraction longer than necessary. A presence she could sense even when she kept her eyes on the floor. She had survived too long not to recognize attention. It frightened her in a way Gunfire never had. This was not the fear of violence. This was the fear of being seen too clearly, of becoming visible in a place where visibility carried consequences. Diane understood the rules of power better than most people gave her credit for. She had grown up watching how quickly lives could shift when the wrong person noticed you for the wrong reason. She also understood the impossibility of what was happening. She was 42 years old. A black woman. A widow. A hotel janitor with aching joints and a quiet routine. Lorenzo Castellano was 38, wealthy beyond measure, and bound to a world where people vanished over misunderstandings. The distance between them was not just social. It was structural. There was no safe version of this. When management told her she was being assigned exclusively to the penthouse for evening cleaning, her stomach tightened. Assignments like that usually came with expectations. She considered declining. Considered requesting a transfer to another floor. She did neither. Turning down work invited questions. Questions led to scrutiny. Scrutiny was dangerous. The first tip appeared folded neatly on the nightstand. $100. More than she made in a shift. Diane left it untouched. When she returned the following night, it was still there. Lorenzo noticed. The next evening, he spoke to her again. "You didn't take it." "I don't need it," she replied. That was not entirely true, but dignity mattered more than money. Always had. He watched her work as if trying to solve a problem that refused to cooperate. He did not crowd her. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, observing, as if her presence disrupted something he thought he understood. "You don't act like everyone else," he said. "That's usually a compliment," she answered, without looking at him. Silence followed. The air did not feel heavy, just alert. Diane finished emptying the trash and moved toward the door. "People will talk," she said, pausing without turning around. "They already do. Let them." She faced him then, calm but firm. "You don't understand. In your world, talk is noise. In mine, it costs people jobs, apartments, stability. I won't let anything happen to you. That's not a promise you can keep." He studied her as if unused to being challenged by someone who had nothing to gain. She left without waiting for a response. After that, the conversations became unavoidable. They happened in doorways, in service corridors, in moments measured carefully so they could be dismissed as coincidence. Lorenzo asked questions that were not intrusive but persistent. Diane answered selectively. She knew how much to give and when to stop. Still, pieces slipped through. She told him about Englewood. About learning early which streets to avoid and which corners meant trouble. About watching her mother leave before dawn and return with swollen hands. About hunger that came and went but never quite disappeared. He listened without interrupting. She told him about Gerald. About how he laughed softly and fixed things even when they did not need fixing. About the pregnancy that ended too soon and the quiet grief that followed her long after the hospital discharged her. Lorenzo did not try to soften any of it. He did not offer platitudes. He simply stayed present. In return, he gave her pieces of himself he had not intended to share. He spoke of Matteo without embellishment. Of growing up in his shadow. Of the night his brother was killed and the way the world narrowed afterward. He told her about the scars beneath his clothes, about waking in the dark with his heart racing, about how his mother died while he was away at school and how guilt settled in places nothing could reach. Their words carried weight because neither of them wasted language. The first time he touched her, it was accidental. His hand brushed hers as she passed him a cloth. The contact was brief, but it lingered longer than it should have. Diane pulled back immediately. "This can't happen," she said. "I know." Neither of them moved away. The kiss happened on the rooftop garden late one night, when the city stretched beneath them in quiet light and the hotel above was still. It was not planned. It was not dramatic. It happened because silence finally became unbearable. Lorenzo hesitated before closing the distance, his hands unsteady. Diane felt it. The fear beneath his control. The uncertainty. When their lips met, it was gentle. Careful. As if either of them might step back. They didn't. The world did not end. No alarms sounded. No doors burst open. What changed was internal. From that point on, restraint became deliberate rather than instinctive. They found spaces that belonged to no one. Times when the hotel slept. Moments stolen from a schedule built on caution. They did not speak of love. Not yet. The word felt too exposed. Instead, they learned each other in quiet ways. Diane traced the scars on his skin, each one a story he did not need to explain. Lorenzo watched the lines at the corners of her eyes, the strength in her hands, the way she remained herself even when wrapped in his arms. He did not rush her. That mattered. Hours passed unnoticed. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they did not. Diane had spent years convincing herself that wanting was a liability. With Lorenzo, she discovered that wanting did not weaken her. It reminded her she was still alive. They were careful. too careful to believe they were invisible. She knew the risk. She knew the imbalance. She knew the cost if anyone decided to make an example of her. Still, she returned. Still, she stayed. For the first time since Gerald died, Diane allowed herself to imagine a future that included another person. Not because Lorenzo offered safety or wealth, but because he offered recognition. She did not know that their closeness had already been noticed. She did not know that the same world she had survived by avoiding was beginning to shift around them. She only knew that invisibility no longer felt like protection, and that frightened her more than anything else ever had. Viktor Petrov had outlived everyone who once challenged him. From his compound outside Hammond, Indiana, he ruled quietly, deliberately, with the patience of a man who believed time itself could be weaponized. His power no longer depended on speed or fear alone. It rested on memory. On grudges stored carefully, revisited often, preserved without mercy. 2 of his sons were buried beneath Midwestern soil. The first died during a shipment dispute along the I-80 corridor. The second fell 6 months later in a retaliatory strike that bore the unmistakable signature of the Castellano family. Viktor attended both funerals without speaking. He kissed their foreheads, closed their caskets, and returned home without tears. Grief for him was not loud. It fermented. He did not seek immediate revenge. He waited. He watched Chicago. He studied patterns. He learned names. He noted weaknesses. When Matteo Castellano was killed, Viktor marked the date and circled it every year. He understood sentiment. He understood that even men built from steel had soft places when memory pressed in. Years passed. Lorenzo Castellano rose into his brother's position, carrying the weight without complaint. Viktor admired that. Respect, however, did not replace hate. The information arrived quietly, passed through hands that knew how to be discreet. A cleaning woman. Black. Older than Lorenzo. Employed at the Meridian Hotel. Regular access to his private suite. At first, Viktor dismissed it as rumor. Power attracted stories. He verified it anyway. The confirmation altered everything. Weakness did not always take the shape of fear or greed. Sometimes it wore the face of care. Attachment. Love. Viktor smiled for the first time in months. The date was chosen carefully. The anniversary of Matteo's death. A private gathering at the Meridian. Restricted guest list. Security tightened but softened by familiarity. Emotion made men careless. The plan required precision, not spectacle. Back in Chicago, Diane felt it before she could explain it. The hotel buzzed differently that evening. Not louder. Sharper. People moved with purpose that felt borrowed rather than routine. She noticed unfamiliar catering staff unloading crates that were too heavy for linens. Security personnel she did not recognize stood near service entrances, their posture wrong for hotel work. The air felt closed. Controlled. Her hands trembled as she folded towels. She tried to reach Lorenzo. Straight to voicemail. She found Carmine near the elevators, his suit pressed, his expression dismissive before she spoke. "Something's off," she said. "People I don't know. Doors that are usually open locked tight." Carmine barely glanced at her. "Go back to work." "Please," she insisted. "I've been here 7 years. This isn't normal." He waved her away. "You're paid to clean, not observe." The words landed harder than he intended. Diane stood still for a moment, weighing every instinct she had honed since childhood. Instinct said leave. Instinct said protect herself. Instinct said she had already said too much. She stayed. She stayed because leaving meant Lorenzo would remain unaware. Because she had seen danger before and survived it by paying attention. Because caring had already cost her safety, and walking away would not undo that. She moved through service corridors with purpose, listening for changes in rhythm. A door slammed where none should have. Footsteps that did not match staff patterns. A voice speaking Russian, low and urgent. The attack began without warning. Kitchen doors burst open under force. Gunfire cut through stainless steel and tile. Bodyguards dropped before alarms sounded. Guests screamed. Plates shattered. Smoke filled the space where celebration had been planned. Chaos spread fast. Diane ran. Not away. Toward. She followed the noise through a side corridor, heart pounding, lungs burning. She knew where Lorenzo would be. She knew the layout better than most security staff. She cut through a service stairwell and emerged into the ballroom as bullets tore through decor. Lorenzo was pinned behind an overturned table near the far wall. Blood streamed from a cut on his forehead, his vision narrowed. His gun lay just out of reach. A shooter advanced from his blind side, weapon steady, face expressionless. Diane saw the angle instantly. There was no time to shout. Her body moved before thought could interfere. She crossed the space between them, faster than she believed possible. She felt the impact before she heard it. Heat. Force. Air leaving her lungs. The bullet tore through her chest. She crashed into Lorenzo, momentum knocking him backward. Surprise fractured the gunman's focus. Lorenzo fired twice, ending the threat as Diane collapsed against him. Blood spread across his white shirt, soaking through his hands as he pressed against her wound. His breathing broke apart. Control abandoned him. Her eyes searched his face. "It's okay," she tried to say. The sound barely formed. He shook his head violently. "Stay with me." Sirens wailed somewhere distant. More gunfire echoed, fading as security regained ground. None of it mattered. Diane's body felt heavy. Cold crept in at the edges. Lorenzo pulled her closer, his voice unsteady, his world reduced to the woman bleeding in his arms. The man who ruled Chicago's underworld, who made decisions that ended lives without hesitation, came apart piece by piece. And for the first time, power meant nothing at all. Diane survived surgery at Northwestern Memorial Hospital because the bullet missed her heart by centimeters. The surgeon said it plainly, without drama. Luck, skill, timing. Lorenzo heard none of it as relief. Only delay. For 3 days, Diane did not wake. Lorenzo never left the chair beside her bed. He refused food. He ignored calls. His phone vibrated itself into silence on the small table, untouched. Men who had watched him command rooms and decide fates stood in the doorway uncertain, unsure whether to speak or retreat. This was not the man they knew. He had buried his brother without tears. He had stood at gravesides steady and controlled, offering comfort instead of needing it. Now he cried openly, shoulders shaking, forehead pressed against Diane's hand as machines breathed for her. His voice broke when he spoke her name, as if saying it hurt. Sleep abandoned him. On the second night, exhaustion crossed into something else. He saw her standing near the door, whole and smiling, only to blink and find empty space. He reached for her voice in the hallway, turned sharply, and found nothing. Once, Carmine found him halfway out of the room, calling her name as if she had wandered off. Vincent Castellano arrived on the third morning, his presence filling the space with expectation. He took in the monitors, the tubes, the woman lying still. "She's just a janitor," he said, confused rather than cruel. "She's a nobody." Lorenzo did not look at him. "Because she saw me," he replied. "The real me. And she loved me anyway." The words ended the conversation. Later, Carmine tried to speak sense into him. He mentioned retaliation, stability, the need to maintain control. Lorenzo's eyes were hollow when he finally turned. "If she dies," he said quietly, "burn it all down. Every piece. I won't need any of it." Carmine had never heard him speak that way. Not once. On the fourth morning, a nurse paused at the door and smiled. Diane's fingers had moved. A faint change, barely measurable, yet enough to pull Lorenzo back from the edge he had been circling without awareness. He leaned forward, gripping her hand as if it anchored him to the room. For the first time since the ballroom, he allowed himself to breathe. Diane's eyelids lifted slowly on the fourth morning. The hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Her gaze found Lorenzo, gaunt, unshaven, his hands clasped tightly around hers. Relief washed over both of them in an instant that seemed to stretch forever. Tears spilled from Lorenzo's eyes, mingling with the faint stubble on his cheeks. Diane tried to speak but found only laughter breaking through, a fragile, trembling sound that soon gave way to words. "You scared me," she said. "I thought I had lost you," he admitted, his voice rough. "Why did you do it?" She lifted a hand to his cheek. "Because a world without you isn't a world I want to live in," she said softly. From that moment, nothing was the same. Lorenzo moved her into the penthouse the day she was released. He brought in a private medical team, installed layers of security that felt excessive to anyone else, and monitored her recovery with unwavering attention. But the changes extended beyond protection. The empire that had defined him for decades became a project in transition. Using his background in architecture, Lorenzo redirected resources toward legitimate developments, investing in housing and businesses that had tangible impact rather than bloodied hands. His family protested. Vincent demanded loyalty to tradition. Cousins muttered about weakness. Lorenzo's eyes, however, held a new clarity. His priorities had shifted irrevocably. Diane adapted quickly. She refused to be intimidated by wealth or influence. Her apartment in Bronzeville remained her sanctuary. She kept contact with colleagues from the Meridian, hosting meals and conversations that bridged her old world and her new one. Together, they navigated this transformation. Love anchored them while power and privilege tried to assert their usual sway. Diane, once invisible, now moved confidently through spaces she had only cleaned. Lorenzo, once untouchable, learned how to bend without breaking, guided by someone who had risked everything for him. The days that followed were not without challenge, but each moment reaffirmed a truth both of them had come to understand: survival was no longer enough. They were learning to live, and to love fully. 1 year had passed since the shooting that had changed everything. Lorenzo had insisted on a trip to Paris, a city he had never visited, but one he felt would honor the life they had fought to protect together. Diane walked beside him along the Seine, her hand wrapped in his, feeling the steady pulse of the city around them. As the sun began to lower, casting warm gold across the horizon, Lorenzo guided her toward the Eiffel Tower. They rode the elevator in silence, each lost in thoughts of the past 12 months. The surgeries, the recovery, the cautious steps into a life that had once felt impossible. At the observation deck, the city stretched endlessly beneath them. Lorenzo turned to Diane, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, he dropped to one knee. From his pocket, he produced a ring, white gold, set with a single unadorned diamond. It was simple, elegant, and entirely reflective of the woman he adored. "I was dead before I met you," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion glimmering in his eyes. "I moved through life waiting for someone to finish what my enemies started. And then you looked at me. You made me remember what it feels like to be alive." Diane's breath caught. All her years of invisibility, all the moments she had endured without recognition, came rushing to the surface. This man, powerful and dangerous in a world she had never entered willingly, was kneeling at her feet, offering her everything. Not out of obligation or fascination, but from choice, from love. She studied his face, memorizing the lines, the shadows, the way his eyes softened at the edges. And in that instant, she understood that survival had never been the goal. Being seen, being wanted, being loved, this was the life she had been denied for too long. "Yes," she whispered, her voice sure and unshakable. "Absolutely yes." The moment held them suspended between the sky and the city below. Two lives, once isolated and scarred, now intertwined irrevocably. Diane Foster, who had once risked everything for the man she loved, now stood on equal ground with him, claiming a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. 3 months later, Diane and Lorenzo stood on the shores of Lake Michigan, sunlight glinting off the water as they exchanged vows in front of friends, family, and a few trusted colleagues. The ceremony was simple, intimate, and filled with laughter and quiet joy, a far cry from the violence that had once defined their lives. Lorenzo had transformed his family's resources into an architecture firm focused on creating affordable housing in neighborhoods like Englewood, offering opportunities that had been scarce in Diane's own youth. Diane, no longer invisible, became his partner in every sense, managing community relations, organizing programs, and ensuring their work touched lives beyond their own. Evenings in the penthouse had a new rhythm. Diane would sit by the window, tracing the scar across her chest with a sense of calm and pride. There were no regrets, only gratitude, for survival, for love, and for the choice to let herself be seen. Their story had taught them both a lesson in courage. True bravery is deciding that something matters more than fear. The most revolutionary act is refusing to disappear. The greatest victory is allowing oneself to be loved fully, without conditions. Diane Foster, the black janitor who had risked everything for a man like Lorenzo, had won through the radical act of love. She had been invisible, she had taken a bullet, and now she was celebrated, cherished, and fully alive. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and share where you are watching from today. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to experience more stories like this. Your support keeps these stories alive.